was
Right,
just like, I don't want to
right.
say something that's wrong, type thing.
Sure, yeah. So you're trying to be careful about language. That's fine. That's good. A lot of what we are doing is being careful about language, right? Yeah, go ahead.
So for the 500 words for this assignment, is that what we're adding on? Or are we starting completely something over for that assignment?
This is something completely new, right? This is what we're going to start on today.
So we're starting from a blank page with that?
Yeah, you're starting from a blank page with this, right? But remember that what you're doing is analyzing two sources, right? You're taking your two secondary sources. We're going to start it in class today, so you'll have something when you go home, right? And you're going to just try to put those two sources in conversation with each other, right? I will explain what that means as we go. But yeah, otherwise, right? So the annotated bibliography is due, that's due tonight, right? And again, I just want to reiterate, right? Even if you don't have all 5 of your sources yet, submit something, because getting some points is better than getting no points. Also, on Wednesday, we're not coming here. We're going down the hall to the computer lab to work on your drafts. So remember to go there instead, right? And if you have not yet done so, please go in and complete the course evaluation. Does anybody have any more questions about anything before we get started?
I don't have a question, I just have like a comment.
Yeah.
I don't know if you know this, but it says that our draft's due tomorrow night.
Okay, it's not. So that's just George of you being screwy. So I'll go in and fix
I
that.
thought it was the 6th.
No, our annotated bibliography is due tonight.
Well, I know tonight is the 6th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what I thought in Georgia it said the 6th.
I was talking about our draft.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, when is
Yeah.
that?
I'll go.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll go in and fix that. So that'll be.
So that is due on Wednesday?
Yeah, so just to give you some time, give you a little more time to complete it. But again, you'll probably do most of the work in class today, right? And on Wednesday, we'll be working on the draft itself, right? But what this is about is making sure you know how to take apart and analyze a source, right? So, any other questions about anything else? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about using sources then, before we get started. So first off, one thing I realized with my other section, I've been assuming that people know the difference between a primary and a secondary source because I assume that gets covered in 1101. Apparently it sometimes doesn't, or else people forget by the time they get here. So does everybody know what the distinction is between a primary and a secondary source?
I would say my primary source is the letter from Birmingham Jail, and then my secondary sources are the ones that I've placed.
Yeah, that's correct, right? So at least you've identified which is your primary source and which are your secondaries, right? So your primary is the subject of your analysis, right? So whatever the thing is that you're actually studying, writing about, right? That is your primary source. Your secondary sources are used to explain or illuminate something about the primary source. And so really what this comes down to is not necessarily something intrinsic about the source itself, but about how you're using it, right? So for example, say you are writing a paper that asks you to analyze the language of the Second Amendment, right? Then the Second Amendment is your primary source, right? If you're writing a paper, however, that is making a broader argument about legal issues pertaining to gun ownership or gun rights, right? Then the Second Amendment might be a secondary source. But in your case, yeah, your primary source is whatever text you've chosen from Reading the World to write about. That's going to be your primary source. Your secondary source is anything that you found to try to explain or analyze that.
Are we
right?
allowed to cite anything from our primary source or no?
Yeah, I'm in fact expecting that you'll quote from the primary source, and that when you quote, you will cite.
Okay, so, and then we're allowed to quote from our secondary sources, right?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. In fact, yeah, like, one thing, I think we talked about this when we did the first paper, but it's probably a good idea to reiterate, like in the humanities, generally speaking, the norm is quoting. In the social sciences, usually you paraphrase or summarize. In the humanities, usually you're supposed to quote. So if you're writing a psych paper, you would probably be taking your secondary sources and summarizing long passages, right? Because this is an English paper, you're going to be quoting from both your primary and secondary sources and subjecting those quotes to analysis, right? And I think that's one of the key points I want to make up here, right? First, when you start working with these sources, don't worry immediately about whether you agree or disagree with them until you have read and evaluated all of the arguments, right? So try to suspend judgment, be objective until you are sure you know what you're talking about, right? Until you're familiar with the material. And then you are going to start picking particular quotations and explain what you take the quote to mean and how it advances your argument, right? Now, when you are trying to integrate these sources into your paper, there are two things to remember. One, that you should be kind of analyzing them where as you go, right? So put the sources in where they fit, right? When you're talking about a particular topic that a source gives you some information on, right? Use the source there. Don't pile all the sources either at the beginning or at the end of the paper, right? Use the sources to provide ongoing analysis and commentary. And when you quote, remember again to try to link the quotes to sentences of your own, right? So use something like this as an example, right? So as Ligo argues in his essay on Audre Lorde, blank citation, this means that, so use a kind of quote sandwich sort of model, right? You start by setting up the quote, right, signaling to your reader that you're about to quote, and maybe even giving a little bit of context for the quote, right? Then you provide the quote itself and the citation, follow with your analysis of the quote, right? Does this make sense to everybody? So, right, signal, context, quote, analysis.
So do we do like, so your signal would, where it starts with the as and ends with the word? Do we do that for everyone, like the same wording, or can we just use different wording?
You can use different wording, yeah. I'm just, as long as you're signaling to your reader that you're about to quote and giving your reader some context to understand the quote, that's all you need to do, right? I'm just kind of showing you a little bit clumsily what this will look like in practice, right? And I've got some examples from some of my own work here to help you out as well. Okay, so next point here, right? Remember that you're not just kind of using the sources to plug in answers. What you want to use them to do is ask better questions, right? So what you're trying to do in any paper is ask and answer some question about what it is that you're reading. And your sources are trying to do the same thing. So what you want to think about is how these sources can lead you not to an answer, like a definitive answer about your text, because then there'd be no reason to write the paper, right? Someone else has already done that work. But what other questions these sources raise that you might be able to try to answer yourself, right? So to give you actually to give you an example of this, I'm going to show you my first sample here. So I want us to focus on the part in brackets. In The Individuated Hobbit, Young, Tolkien, and the Archetypes of Middle-earth, Timothy O'Neill claims that the Gandalf of the Hobbit is, quote, merely an old conjurer with much dignity who could not bear looking ridiculous. The implication in O'Neill's description is that Gandalf is somehow ridiculous, and indeed, despite his capacity for getting his friends out of the occasional scrape, he is often clownish. Much of the humor in Tolkien's characterization of the wizard comes not from his actions or, as O'Neill would have it, affronts to his dignity, however. It comes instead from Gandalf's frequent soliloquies on the ambiguities of spoken language. In his approach to language is an ever-shifting play of signifiers in which the signified is never quite stable. Gandalf pioneers an approach to the analysis of language that would be taken up 30 years later in the late 1960s by Jacques Derrida and his deconstructionist acolytes. Now, you don't have to know what signifiers are here, or who Jacques Derrida is, or what deconstruction is, to figure out what's been done here, right? So how am I using this particular source? How am I using this quote from Timothy O'Neill? What am I doing with it?
Did you use it to describe the language that's been used? Like the spoken language?
Well, he doesn't mention the language, right?
Describing Gandalf, or like how he's like characterized, I guess?
Yeah, exactly. So he starts by talking about the characterization of this particular figure in the novel, right? And so then what I've done is use this as a jumping off point for something that I think the source missed, right? That in his characterization, right, he's just, that essentially that the source of humor is something other than what the source says it is, right? So I'm using the source to raise a question here. It's like, well, what actually makes this character funny, right? What actually makes this character humorous? How does it actually work in the novel? So this is actually this is a good way, particularly early in the paper, to use sources, right? To use them as a jumping off point rather than as a definitive answer, right? Say, okay, like I agree to the source with the source up to this point, right? But I think I can piggyback off of them to come up with a different idea. Now, the next thing you're going to want to do, generally speaking, is try to put sources into conversation with each other, right? Think about how they might talk to one another. So I'm going to give you another example of this. And this is the kind of thing you're going to try to do for the assignment we're going to work on today, right? So this particular article starts with what we call a literature review, right? Kind of rundown of a number of different things that have been published on this subject and an evaluation of those arguments, right? So we started with much recent criticism of Louis MacNeice's work has focused on its Irish dimension. Specifically, it has attempted to solve the problem of where, or indeed whether, to place MacNeice in some canon or other of Anglo-Irish or Northern Irish poetry. Irish critics have paid particular attention to the question of McNeese's nationality, which has been something of a vexed issue throughout the poet's career and its afterlife. Critics and poets of nationalist inclination like Tom Paulin, Declan Kiberd, and Thomas Kinsella have tended either to exclude McNeese altogether, as Kinsella famously banished him from his New Oxford Book of Irish Verse, or to damn him with faint praise, as Kiberd does in Inventing Ireland, in which he wrongly associates McNeese with the ascendancy and casts him as a critic of Ireland, both north and south, calling down a plague on both houses. Paulin, meanwhile, calls him the man from no part, whose poetry of modern urban life often resembles a commercial jingle. While these statements are meant to be complimentary to McNeese, they nonetheless suggest a poet of surfaces whose engagement with issues of Irish regional identity is at most limited. So what I'm doing here, right, is listing a group of critics who broadly agree with each other about this particular poet, right? And using them as a foil for the argument that I'm about to construct, right? These people all think this about this particular poet. I think differently, and here's why. So this is one way to put sources in conversation with each other, right? Find places where they agree. Now, another thing that you could do is find places where your sources disagree, and then try to find space for yourself in that conversation, right? It's like, well, source A sounds better to me, and here's why. Or source B sounds better to me, and here's why.
So in this, like, it's okay to be like, say how you feel?
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, I hope you do. If you're just repeating what your sources say, then you haven't done any real thinking on your own, right? So I absolutely want you to be telling me what you think, right? Not just what the sources say, right? Use the sources as a starting point, right? Use them to help fill in gaps in your own knowledge or information, and use them to get a sense of what the broader field of argument is about this topic, right? But, like I said at the beginning of class, right, if you're just repeating what the source says, right, then there's no point in doing the paper. Right? The whole idea is to try to move our knowledge of this topic forward, right? To try to say something new about it. And like, well, like you guys are, for the most part, you're first-year college students, right? I'm not expecting you to completely reinvent the wheel here. But it is perfectly okay and acceptable, and indeed admirable, to have a principled disagreement with a source, right? As long as you can point to why you disagree.
So it's okay to be biased. And how would we do that without being biased, I guess I should say.
What I guess I'm not entirely sure what you mean by bias. Like you mean like in favor of a particular source and not another?
I get, yeah. Like if we, like I'm writing about Andre, where like if we agree or like strongly disagree, like we're supposed to like look over all the sources and what they're saying and everything. But
Yeah.
like I shouldn't just be like, and they are wrong because or what they're right, whatever it is.
Yeah. Well, here's so when you're still doing your research, this is when you need to suspend your judgment and not worry about agreement or disagreement, right? But then once you're starting to work it into the paper, you have to worry about that, right? You have to think about which sources you agree with and which you disagree with. So, yeah, I mean, it's not like you're not going to be able to be completely even-handed and neutral and still make an argument, right? You're going to have to come down on one side or another. Or really more on one of multiple sides, right? So yeah, it is completely okay to take issue with the arguments that a source makes, provided that you can do so in a reasonable and civil manner. In fact, that's actually usually like kind of one of the more advanced thinking steps that we look for here, right? Is if you can take a source and have a reasonable disagreement with it.
We're allowed to disagree with our source.
What's that?
We're allowed to disagree with our source?
Oh, 100%, yeah. And I mean, look, I think, I may have mentioned this in a previous session, but remember, by and large, academia is a small place, right? The people who work on particular topics, if they don't know each other personally, they know each other's work, right? So, this piece here on, Louis MacNeice, right? This Northern Irish poet, I'm sure none of you have ever heard of, right? There are about 6 people who work on Louis MacNeice. We all know each other. We all sit on the same panels at conferences. We all read each other's work, right? So, because we work in a very, very small subfield, most of us know each other personally. And we have disagreements, relatively civil disagreements. We can all get along well enough. But, if you're looking at somebody like, say Shakespeare, it's a much bigger field. But people are still going to be aware of the work of most of the major scholars in that field, right? So think about this as 2 people who don't always agree but who know each other pretty well, sitting in a room, talking about something they both spent a lot of time studying, right? And you are then trying to find a place for yourself in their conversation, right? This can be this can be intimidating when you don't feel like you have the same level of expertise, right? But remember that they don't have the fact that they're actually having an argument about these things, right? Means that they don't have all the answers. So what you're trying to do is use them to ask a question that you think they may have missed, right? And provide an answer to that question. Okay, so does everybody more or less understand? Is there anything that's unclear to anybody right now?
Are we still doing this on format?
Yeah. Yep.
So we just don't put the quote and then whatever, we just go into it. How in the reflection papers we would choose a quote.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. You don't need to put the quote at the top of the page anymore. No, just start the paper. Yeah. And yeah, citation format should be MLA style.
Can we go over how we did the MLA for our sources? Because I'm a little confused.
Yeah, me
Okay.
too. That's a great question.
Okay.
I know doesn't it go the very, very end of your paper?
Yes.
I need to know how you put that so I don't get counted off.
Okay. So here's what an MLA kind of works cited page looks like. It depends on what kind of source you're citing, right? So if you're citing something from, say, a journal, right, which is probably going to be what most of your citations are. So let's actually take this here as an example here. So title of essay.
Which one are you using?
The Tolkien Studies one, but it doesn't really the Gandalf the Wand.
Oh, okay.
It doesn't really matter.
We put our name like that and everything?
What's that?
We put our name down too?
No, this is my name because I'm the author.
Okay. Dang, that made me sign.
Okay, so you start with author name, the title of the article, the title of the journal, volume number, say volume 2, the issue number, the date, and then the page numbers. So this is how you do a journal article. A book book chapter would be a little bit different. Right, so think back to what you had to do for paper one for that, right? So let's say that you are, using, you're, quoting from Thomas Hobbes, right? Right, so you got Hobbes, Thomas. Right. From Leviathan. Then you have the title of the book. Reading the World, 4th edition. Edited by Michael Austin. Published by Norton. 2020. And whatever the page numbers are, right?
So we're supposed to say like from Leviathan, like we can't just say Leviathan.
Well, just simply because that's just an excerpt from Leviathan, so that's the way the textbook titles it, right? Now, if you're citing a whole book, right, this is what that looks like. So, for a whole book, author name, title, place of publication, publisher, date. And these are the three MLA style citation types that you will actually need to know for this, right? I doubt that you will have any sources that are not journal articles, book chapters, or books.
So it's where the journals, like
Uh-huh.
a lot like that one, even that one, a lot of them don't have like a place like New York or whatever that it says that they're from, so we don't have to put that.
No, that's for journal articles and even for book chapters, the place of publication isn't necessary. Only if you're citing a whole book.
Okay.
And again, if you have any questions as you're working about citation, all right, just Google Purdue OWL MLA citation, and they have a whole page dedicated to it, right? That will show you models of everything that you need to know. Okay, anybody have any other questions?
Where it says e-journal, that's a journal article, right?
Yeah, if it says e-journal, then that just means it's an online journal.
Okay.
So sometimes online journals don't actually have page numbers. So in that case, what you would put instead of the page numbers is just no pagination.
Okay, so if I'm looking at my sources, one of them starts on, I want to say 62 because the first page doesn't have like a number.
Okay, but all of your sources have page numbers.
Yes.
Okay, so the no pagination thing only applies if it's an online journal that doesn't separate into pages, right? And doesn't actually have page numbers. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so what you can do now is turn to page 238 in Writing Analytically. So what you're going to work on here now is assignment 1, right? You're going to try to get 500 words total out of this, right? So you're choosing 2 secondary sources you want to use in your paper. You're going to briefly summarize the arguments of the parts that you chose. And then you're going to try to imagine, without passing judgments, how these 2 writers might respond to each other's arguments, right? How these 2 different critics might respond to each other's arguments, and why.
I'm confused, like, for the working with sources, all that you went through, are we doing that for this assignment? Or I'm confused.
For this assignment, do you mean for?
Like how you just went through working with sources, all that, we're using what you just told us with that to do this?
Yeah, you're certainly, so this is actually for the paper, right? This is more for the paper. What we're doing for this assignment, right, is you're just going to practice a little bit examining 2 sources objectively. Basically what you're doing is this part of what we just said, right?
So within this, we don't be evaluative, we just be like objective.
Exactly. With this, you're still just being objective, right? You're just analyzing the sources objectively and trying to get them to talk to each other.
So we're comparing one source to another and how they connect.
And again, like just trying to imagine how they might talk to each other, right? So if you put these two scholars in a room together, right, how might they respond to each other's arguments?